That's great. Thank you so much for making this happen during your conference. We truly appreciate that, and the support you're making, the time to actually talk us through this very fascinating topic. We very much look forward to what's happening in the next hour and a half. So the structure as it is, Rich, just before we start the introduction, etc., is that we will start, I will make the introduction, then you take over obviously for the slides and the topics that you want to show us today. And we leave some, I mean, it's 1 hour and a half. We'd like to leave like at least 10 to 15 minutes toward the end, if you don't mind, to take questions from the teams here, and if we do have any questions on the chat, so we'll make it a little bit interactive. Are you okay with that?
And it's great if people want to interrupt me. And Anwar, do me a favor. I may not be paying attention to the chat during my presentation, so you should just interrupt me anytime you think there's a question that
I'm good at that. Don't worry about it. Okay, very good.
Great.
Very good.
So, you know, maybe we'll do all the questions during the talk as opposed to afterwards. That'll be fine.
Yeah, that's perfect. So, Samia, we wait for you to confirm that we can start, and then we can ignite the session.
What's the time? 2 minutes to...
Just so you know, if we run into a bandwidth problem, you know, because I'm in a hotel with 10,000 other computer scientists around me, if we run into a bandwidth problem, first I'll turn off my video so that hopefully the slides still work. So that'll be my first attempt. And then if we really run into a problem, I might even reconnect, but using my cell phone as the internet provider as opposed to the hotel. But so far, this is looking very good. So let's cross our fingers that this works.
Well, let's start. So, je dirais, peut commencer? Up. It's a big problem with this mic arrow up.
Okay, I guess we can start now. Thank you so much, Semi. So I guess everyone is here now and we can ignite this fascinating session. I'm very much looking forward to that. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed colleague of the machine learning and the AI industry, it is with great honor and privilege that I stand in front of you today as the moderator of this event. We are gathered here under the auspice of the Tunisian AI Society to deliver on to the profound insights and expertise of one of the foremost authorities in the field, Dr. Rich Caruana. I'm pronouncing this right? Yes, here we go.
It's very good, yes.
Very good. So the Dr. Rich is a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research and brings a wealth of expertise and experience to our discussion. Before joining Microsoft, so Dr. Rich had a lot of position in prestigious institutions, including the Computer Science Department at the Cornell University, UCLA Medical School, and CMU Center for Learning and Discovery. So you have a PhD as well, and where you had the privilege of working alongside of luminaries like Tom Mitchell and Herb Simon as well. So we're very much looking to actually dive into your, expertise and the illustration of this career, where you had a lot of, numerous accolades, including the NSF CAREER Award in 2004 for your work on meta clustering. You also have been honored with the Best Paper Award in 2005. 2014, another honor as well. So let me say that in behalf of the Tunisian AI society and myself, we're super excited to have you here today. So what we're going to do today is to actually, the plan, according to what I understand, and again, I'm the moderator, I'll leave the master class to his elder, is we are going to actually have a captivating journey through a series of half a dozen of case studies, each of one are unveiling the hidden treasures of the glass box machine learning and the more remarkable case studies to actually illuminate the unexpected and often like unseen patterns within data patterns, and then how we can also mitigate them before deploying the black box models. It applies to the healthcare industry, it applies also to the finance industry, maybe at a high level. Eventually, we can look after the question on how it could be applicable for different industries and different topics. So I leave the floor to you. As Dr. Rich has said earlier, and for those who just join in right now, we're happy to take the questions along the way. So if there is any questions popping in your mind, please feel free to write it down, and we will be able to make it as interactive and as fun as possible for everyone in this meeting room. Thank you so much. I'll leave the floor to you, Dr. Rich.
Thank you. Thank you, 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒉, for the nice introduction, and thanks for inviting me to give the presentation. So what we're going to talk about is the value of intelligibility, interpretability, glass box machine learning, and the risk of using black box models. Before I do that, though, I want to thank a lot of people who have worked with me on this for the last 10 years. In red, these are graduate students, some who are here at the conference that I'm at in New Orleans. In green are some people at Microsoft who have worked on this. I do a lot of work in machine learning for healthcare, so I've had a number of doctors work with me, and then other collaborators from other universities who have also worked with me, including one of my advisors, Tom Mitchell. Okay, so let's jump in. I'm just going to do something a little bit fun and high level first, and just give you a history of machine learning. So perceptrons, which are sort of linear neural nets, were popular in the 50s. Then K-nearest neighbor became very popular with statisticians in the 60s. Decision trees were invented both in Australia and in the US in the 70s and became very popular. These are one of the first learning methods that are considered interpretable. Then decision trees were still popular in the 80s, but we saw the second coming of neural nets. These are now neural nets with nonlinear hidden layers, so these can learn more complex functions. The neural nets are still around in the 90s, but we start to see more principled methods such as Bayes nets and support vector machines. By about 2000, boosted trees in random forests, which are ensembles of decision trees, start to become more important than neural nets, and eventually they replace SVMs as well. Some people thought SVMs were going to be the end, the best thing we could do in supervised learning, but now we see other methods that are better than them. By 2010, we start having deep neural nets, so that's very exciting. So that's the third coming, I guess, of neural nets. But on tabular data, data for which you know what each feature means, you know, that would be features like age or blood pressure or income or gender. On data sets like that, it turns out even in 2010 and now, things like gradient boosted trees in random forest, ensembles of trees, are still sort of the best at these tabular data sets. Deep neural nets are best on things like images, text, acoustics, you know, raw signals and stuff like that. Now, of course, things have gotten very exciting. 2020, we suddenly have ChatGPT, we have large language models. So this is maybe the fourth reincarnation of neural nets. What's interesting, though, is for tabular data, which more than half of the world's problems are tabular, there's a real question of what's going to be most valuable for them going forward. Is ChatGPT, LLMs, are they going to be the best for tabular data? Are boosted trees in random forests going to be best? Something else? No one really knows at this point. And in fact, the workshop I'm attending today, except for right now, is on tabular learning with LLMs. And we have a paper in that workshop. What we think might happen is that glass box machine learning might replace black box methods like gradient boosted trees in random forests for tabular data. And then LLMs like ChatGPT will remain the dominant learning method for things like text, images, video, stuff like that. We think that's an actual possibility right now. Now you might think, well, that's crazy. There's no way glass box machine learning is going to replace black box machine learning. And that's because you've heard there's a trade-off that black box methods are more accurate than glass box methods. So that there's this trade-off, if you want high accuracy, you got to use something that's inherently complex and not interpretable, a black box method. And if you want to be intelligible, you're going to have to take a loss in accuracy and use something simpler like logistic regression or naive Bayes. The good news is that for tabular data, this is not true anymore. This was true until, say, 10 years ago, but it is no longer true. We're going to talk today about these EBMs, explainable boosting machines, and you're going to see that these methods are just as accurate as black box methods like boosted trees, neural nets, and random forests. But surprisingly, they're even more interpretable than good old standard interpretability methods like logistic regression and linear regression. Now, let me just give you a little evidence of that before we start. So here's 10 different data sets, and these are AUCs reported on the test data set. And this is EBMs, the method we're going to talk about today. And the average AUC on the test data is 0.866. So these are glass box methods, and they're doing 0.866. If we go to the right, we've got black box methods like random forests and depth optimized gradient boosted trees. And the best of these is the gradient boosted trees. And notice that its AUC on the test data is also 0.866. Now, it does not mean if you compare on each data set that we always get identical performance for every data set with these two methods. But on average, the glass box method is performing about as well as the black box method. And that's really extraordinary. That's something we would not have believed was possible 10 years ago. Now, take this with a grain of salt. I'm one of the authors on this paper, so maybe you don't want to trust it. But here's some work by Cynthia Rudin, who is also here at the conference. Cynthia is the other person best known for work in glassbox learning. And Cynthia's students 3 or 4 years ago did some experiments. They used our open source code, so they were able to run our glassbox method, the EBMs, and they ran their own methods. And our glassbox method, the EBMs, turned out to be the most accurate. That's the little arrows pointing to these blue lines. And they also observed that the best interpretable models in their experiments, it turned out to be the EBMs, performed about as well as the best black box models, which again in their experiments was XGBoost. So this is independent confirmation. We didn't even know this work was happening when they published it. So this is all very good news. It means that glassbox methods are now really competing head to head with black box methods in terms of accuracy, but then you get the benefit of being glass box. We're not going to talk about this today, but I just want to bring it up. EBMs are what we're going to focus on. So this is EBMs here and EBMs here, but there's this other glass box method called NAMs, neural additive models. And that's a way of training exactly the kind of models I'm going to show you, but training those models with neural nets. And we get very comparable accuracy between EBMs and NAMs on most data sets. And the reason why I wanted to mention that is just that some people don't use boosted decision trees in Python. Instead, they use GPUs and neural nets. And I just wanted to show you that you are able to get glassbox learning now with both neural nets and with EBMs. So, and that's very valuable. For example, we know some people in healthcare who actually prefer neural nets to boosted decision trees. So they tend to use glassbox learning with neural nets as opposed to with EBMs. But we're going to focus today on the EBMs. Let me tell you what these models are, and then I'll give you all the case studies that Alex mentioned. So this is linear regression, the blue line, right? It's just a straight line on some feature. And then if we need to make this classification, logistic regression, we pass the model that predicts all these blue lines, we pass the final prediction through a sigmoid so that the predictions are probabilities on 0, 1. Very interpretable. Sadly, it's not very accurate on complex data sets because it can't model nonlinearities. And sometimes this even gets the sign wrong. That is because it doesn't fit a nonlinear data set well, it'll trade off trying to get the slope right on some terms and actually get the slope wrong on other terms. So you have to be very careful with these linear models on complex data sets. They often do things that you don't anticipate. Now, black box learning is at the other extreme, not very interpretable. That's why we call it black box, but it can be very accurate because, of course, it's designed to model nonlinearities. One thing you do have to be careful of is you might use something like LIME or SHAP to try to open up the black box and see what's going on inside of it. But one thing you'll find out when we do that is that there's often spurious effects learned by these black box models. And that's because they're very complex models. And unless you have a very large data set, they can learn some things that are not appropriate, that are not warranted by the data. In the middle, we have what's known as generalized additive models, of which EBMs, the explainable boosting machines, is just one type of GAM, just one type of generalized additive models. These are more interpretable than linear logistic regression, which is kind of a surprise. And that's because this is the response, this blue line for some feature, as opposed to just a slope that's going up. And to an expert, this response makes more sense than just the line that's going up. So they actually understand that, oh, this is the region of low risk. This is sort of normal, maybe if this is healthcare. And then risk goes up rapidly, and then it levels off if the value is too high. Also, there's a little elevated risk if we go below normal. All of this makes a lot of sense to an expert. And the straight line in a linear model, of course, can't do this because it can only do a straight line. It has to kind of split the difference and just sort of do a rough straight line that approximates all of this. And in particular, the straight line will tend to go up, and it'll miss that there's an elevation in risk at the low end of the scale here. It'll just predict that that's even lower and lower risk, which is not correct. So these models are really nice. They're what might be called the Goldilocks models. They're just the right amount of complexity, but they're still simple enough that they're interpretable. And what's nice about them is because of the reduced complexity, often what they learn, even from medium to small size data sets, is reasonably correct. That is, you can trust what these models are learning as being warranted by the statistics of the data. Now, we did not invent these. These were invented by Trevor Hastie and 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒉, two of the most famous statisticians in the world. These were invented by these guys in the late 80s. So these have been around, for 40 years now, for a long, long time. And this was Trevor Hastie's thesis at Stanford when he was a graduate student. And they invented these models for all the reasons that we want to use them. They were also after interpretability, but the ability to model nonlinear phenomena. And our contribution is, if you think about it, since they invented these, the internet has happened. Computer horsepower is 1,000 to 1,000,000 times larger. We have larger data sets, partly because we can handle those larger data sets. And a lot has happened in machine learning in the last 30 years. So our contribution is going to be to take advantage of the computer horsepower, the data sets, and all the tricks in machine learning. We are going to just be able to fit these models better than Trevor and 𝒂𝒊𝒄𝒉 were ever able to do, because we have new tricks that we can use to train these models. So our contribution is going to be to get these models working so well that they now compare with these black box models. Let me show you briefly what they look like. This will be the only math probably in the whole presentation. Linear model, of course, is an intercept plus a slope times a feature, slope times a feature. That's a linear model. And if you need to do logistic regression to do classification, you just wrap a sigmoid around this. You pass it through the sigmoid function here. Full complexity models, let's not talk about that. They can be anything, k-nearest neighbor, large decision trees, ensembles of trees, deep neural nets. These can be very complex phenomena. So let's not talk about the specific form of any one of them. What's interesting is this generalized additive model in the middle. And this is the simplest generalized additive model. It's a function of the first feature plus another function of the second feature. It's a function of every feature. And the important thing to note here is that it's a function of one feature at a time, and addition is used to combine these functions. Both of those are critical. Generalized comes from the function of a feature. This can be a nonlinear function. It can be multimodal. It can be very complex. So that's the generalized in generalized additive models. And the additive part of additive models is that we use addition to combine these. And that's very important because it means you can look at this function, see what it's telling you, and then separately look at this function. And that's because their effects are going to be added together in the model. It turns out mathematically we could fit this class of functions if we use multiplication, like f1 of x1 times f2 of x2. But then you can't reason about function 1 independently of function 2 because multiplication makes that hard to do. So the fact that it's additive is very important. Okay, this is a very restricted function class here because it's only functions of individual features. Notice there's no functions of 2 features or 3 features. We can make this class more important, more flexible, more powerful by doing a sum of functions of single features. That's the line above. But now we can also do a sum of functions of pairs of features. So now we can do pairwise interactions. And then we can do a sum of functions of triples of features. We can go further. In fact, we're going to restrict ourselves to main effects, functions of single features, and just a small number of important pairwise effects. And we're going to restrict ourselves to this model class because, as you'll see, these are graphable. These are things, as humans, we can understand. It'll turn out this is the function of a single feature is a 2D plot. Function of 3 features is a 3D plot. Function of 2 features is a 3D plot. A function of 3 features is a 4D plot. And humans start to have trouble understanding 4D plots. Okay. I'm going to jump into this first example. This will take the most. Yeah, go for it.
If you don't, before that,
No,
we do
no,
have a
go for it.
question on clarifying what actually we have one of the attendees asking what is EBM in this instance, and if you can explain it a little further, that will be great.
Sure. Okay, so our goal is to learn functions of features. Okay, so we're going to learn a function of feature 1 at the same time we're learning a function of feature 2 and a function of feature 3. So we're going to learn all these functions at the same time. And we have to have some learning algorithm that's going to do that for us. Statisticians 45 years ago used to use splines, but they were too simple and they have some undesirable properties. We have 2 different ways of doing this right now that are working very well. One is boosted decision trees. So we have a way of training boosted decision trees so that they can only learn functions of features 1 at a time, but then they get to go round robin through all the features and learn these functions all in parallel. So that's EBMs, explainable boosting machines. So that's what EBM stands for. It is a form of generalized additive. It's an algorithm for generalized additive models. And then, as I mentioned a few slides ago, we also now have an algorithm for training using neural nets to train these feature functions also. And what we're going to do is we're not going to concentrate so much on the algorithm. We're going to look at lots of these learned feature functions so that you can see what you get from these. Now, if people are interested in the algorithm, well, first of all, it's public and it's available open source, so you can run it yourself. But also, if people are very interested, I can even come back sometime and talk in more detail about the algorithm. So hopefully that answers the question.
I hope so. Very well.
Oh, okay. So we're going to spend time on pneumonia. That's going to give you lots of examples. And then I'm very quickly going to go through 5 or 6 more data sets, and you'll understand things. So yeah, go for it.
Sorry, can I ask a question? Can you please go back 1 slide?
Sure.
Yes, so I have a question regarding the plot in the middle. I'm just wondering, what is this, like the line on the bottom with the red, it's like spikes. So what is this exactly?
Oh, good question. That is the density of the data. So most of the data is sitting in this region where you see the dense pink. And then there are fewer samples out here, for example, at the very high value region of this feature. And you'll see more examples of this in the next few slides. Yeah.
Okay, so how do we link the density of the data with this blue line?
The density just tells us where most of our samples are. So most people, maybe this feature is body temperature, and this is normal 37C, maybe this is 38C, 39C, 40C, which is very high risk, and maybe this is hypothermia, which might be 36C. And you can see most patients seem to have a body temperature that's, let's say, 36 to 37C. So this just says most patients, in this case, are normal, with fewer patients who have a mild fever, even fewer patients who have high fever, and then the least number of patients have very, very high fever. So the sample just gives us an idea of, you notice that the error bars get larger where we have less sample,
Yeah.
and the error bars are tighter where we have more sample. And that's to be expected because there's more data to support this part of the function than this part of the function.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, sure. So, and feel free to keep asking questions. So, okay, this is an old data set. It has 46 features. We know things about the history of the patient, the physical exam they had, like their respiration rate, their heart rate, their blood pressure. They all had blood tests, so we have the results of the blood test. And they all had a chest x-ray. This is an old data set. We wouldn't do chest x-rays now all the time because they're risky themselves. But we have readings from a radiologist on the chest x-ray. 46 features. This model is a function of a feature plus a function of a feature. So we're going to have 46 functions, one for each feature. And then we'll throw in 10 pairwise interactions. So we'll actually have 56 functions. Let me show you what that looks like from a high level. Here is a function that was learned for risk. This is the chance of dying from pneumonia. You have pneumonia, and we're trying to figure out your chance of dying from pneumonia. This is the contribution to risk, up as higher risk, down as lower risk, just as a function of your age. This is whether you have asthma or not. This is as a function of your blood glucose. This is a function of your blood pH. Remember, there's going to be 56 of these functions, and I'll show you a few of them in more detail. And the way the model is used, and all these functions are learned in parallel. That's critical that you learn all of these things together. So if you're familiar with marginalization in statistics, that's when you do things one feature at a time. This is not one feature at a time. These are all learned in parallel. And yet the algorithm is restricted to learning something that can be decomposed into individual functions of individual features with addition combining them. So you look up the patient's age on the x-axis here, read the y contribution, which is a contribution to risk. And in this case, it might be minus 0.23. So you write that number down. Then let's say the patient does not have asthma, so they're on the left here. That might add minus 0.15. You look up at the bottom here, their blood urea nitrogen, that's a blood test, and you find where their blood urea nitrogen is, you write down that score, and you're going to get 56 numbers like this, one from each of the graphs, and you add those numbers together. The larger that score is, the higher the risk the patient is, smaller it is, the lower risk they are. And then there's also an intercept in the model. And then you just do the standard logistic regression. This is classification. Logistic regression is 1 over 1 plus e to the minus score. And typically in logistic regression, these would be a linear model. So this would, the exponent here would be a linear model, the intercept plus a slope times the feature, slope times the feature, and all these graphs would have to look like straight lines. But we're doing a nonlinear logistic regression. So our exponent looks like nonlinear lines, nonlinear graphs sitting up here in the exponent. And you just add all of these terms together, and that gives you the patient's, in this case, probability of mortality, chance of dying from pneumonia. And it's very important. These are all on a log scale if we're doing classification. So small differences in the score can make a huge difference. So a score, including the intercept of 0, is a 50-50 probability of mortality. +1 is a 73%, +3 is a 95%, -3 is a 5% risk. So what's important about this is you're going to see some graphs now, and a small difference, like a 0.5 difference on a single features graph, is a huge difference in probability, given that we're going to have 46 or 56 of these graphs in the model. So if one feature is making a big difference, like 0.5, that's a very significant effect because it's on a log scale. Okay, this is the risk as a function of age. So that's that first graph we were looking at. And the bottom, I've got a traditional histogram of the density of our patients instead of those little tiny pink spike plots we were talking about. And you can see most patients are between 60 and 90. There are some younger patients. You had to be an adult to be in this study, so you have to be over 18. And there are some patients out, in their 90s and up to 100. This is the risk model learned by the EBM. And an important thing is this is what the model actually learns. Like we use millions of boosted decision trees to learn this graph. But once we have the graph, we throw the trees away. The graph really is the model. And you could give this model accurately to somebody by printing it on 56 pieces of paper. And as long as they do their arithmetic correctly, they will be able to use the model correctly. The model really is these graphs. This is not an approximation of some more complex thing like it is with SHAP. This really is the model. So let's talk about this model. So down is low risk, up is higher risk. And again, remember, these are log odds, chance of dying from pneumonia. Lowest risk is everybody under 50. So, it's good to be young, no surprise there. And the model says that everybody 20s, 30s, and 40s, looks sort of equally low risk. It doesn't seem to distinguish between them, even though it could if it needed to. So these are all low risk. Then risk goes up gradually, slowly as you go into your 50s and into your 60s. Then there's a rapid rise in risk happening right around 67, 68, 69. This is US data. And in the United States, this is typical age of retirement. So this is a retirement effect. And surprisingly, for pneumonia risk at least, retirement increases risk as opposed to decreases risk. And there's a number of possibilities for that. One, in the United States, your healthcare insurance and provider probably changes. So that's a difference. Also, the fact that you're not going to work every day, it might mean your urgency to get care because you're not feeling well, is a little less urgent. It's like, oh, wait another day, I can just stay home and sleep and, I'll go tomorrow if I have to. And delaying is not a good thing if you've got pneumonia. And there are other possibilities. Maybe, in the US, possibly you've decided to move when you retire and you don't even have a doctor, lined up yet in your new location. So there are multiple reasons why people who have retired might be elevated risk as opposed to lower risk. And then risk continues to climb rapidly as you become elderly, as you go into the 70s and the 80s. I think that's not a surprise. These patients are getting old. This is surprising, though, a step function rise in risk right at 85, which is a very round number. And then it's surprising risk is almost kind of flat through the upper 80s and 90s. And then even more surprising, a step function drop in risk that happens just past 100, at about 100, 101. This rise in risk at 85, there is nothing in healthcare policy, insurance policy in the US, which says that you should treat a patient who's 86 years old different than a patient who's 84 years old. And biologically, you don't see these sharp changes in health, in individuals. You might see a sharp change in health for a single individual at some point, but in aggregate, like there's nothing where the model, in your body suddenly knows you went around the sun 86 times as opposed to 85 times. So this is some artifact of the way we treat patients. And we believe what's happening here is that 85 is being used as a round number by clinicians and by patients and their family to sort of separate patients who are younger old patients from patients who are very elderly old patients. And don't forget, this is also a data set from 30, 40 years ago. So life expectancy in this data set is probably around 80. So people who are over 85 are definitely on the elderly side of being old. And we think what happens is, it's sort of like, well, grandpa's 87 years old. Grandpa has a number of illnesses associated with being 87. Because of those illnesses, that's actually why grandpa got pneumonia. The first round of antibiotics didn't help grandpa. Maybe we're not doing grandpa any favors here. Grandpa's time is approaching rapidly because of all of these illnesses that grandpa has, and now pneumonia. And we think maybe less aggressive care is given to patients who are over 85 on average compared to patients who are considered younger, under 85. So we think this is completely an unconscious decision being made by clinicians, patients, their family, to maybe be less aggressive in their care of patients who have made it over 85. We think a similar explanation works for 100. Being a centenarian, being over 100, that's very extraordinary even today, even more extraordinary 30 or 40 years ago when this data was collected. And we think what happens is pneumonia is ultimately considered a reasonably treatable illness. And we think when a patient has made it to 100, the doctors just do not give up. Okay. And In the United States, 4 out of 5 patients who are over 100 would be women, because women are more likely to survive to being 100 or longer. And we think it's sort of like, wow, you've got a 100-year-old female patient who now has pneumonia. Their 101st birthday is 2 months from now, and the doctors just do not want to give up. They do everything they can. And we think it's not only the clinicians who don't want to give up. We think the patient may not want to give up. The patient's grandchildren may not want to give up. So we think there is a lot of attempt here to, if possible, cure the pneumonia and get the patient past it. You know, go for the record, basically. You've already made it to 100, let's go for 101. And when I talk to doctors, they definitely tell me this is a real effect, that they actually do sort of fight more aggressively for patients who either want them to fight very aggressively, or patients who have made it to 100 to sort of go for the record. Okay. I've just told you a bunch of stories. You know, it's good to be young, 50, 60 is not too bad. Retirement in the US often is associated with higher risk from pneumonia. Getting old is not good for you, as you would expect. There's a weird transition that occurs at 85. We think that's a social effect. And then a really interesting, surprising transition at 100, because this is not a biological effect. This has got to be due to somehow that we're treating patients, our decision making. This model has 56 graphs in it. I can't show you all of them. It is the most accurate model anyone has been able to train on this data. So we can tell you this detailed kind of story of how the model works, how this piece of the model works. And we can do that without losing any accuracy. This is a very accurate model. The only other model that is almost as accurate is a neural net, which is not interpretable. So that's amazing that we get this kind of accuracy. There's more, though, which is this model. Remember, I said it really is these graphs. This is the model. This is not an explanation of something else. The graphs are the model. I mean, the code for using this model really looks like these graphs. It's 2D vectors and 3D vectors, and you just do table lookup. Here's the cool thing. How many of you believe that biologically, a 105-year-old is lower risk than a 95-year-old, right? I mean, the treatment might be more aggressive for the 105-year-old, and therefore they might have a better chance of survival. But biologically, it doesn't make sense that a 105-year-old is lower risk. So one of the things we can do with this model, clinicians don't like the fact, they're interested in the fact that risk drops above 100, but they don't want the model to do that. They really want the model to have risk constantly going up with age at this end of the scale. Because this model is graphs, we can allow the clinician to redraw this part of the model. And now the model will do what they say. And the clinicians believe that this is the safer model to use clinically, even though the data statistics do suggest that patients over 100 are lower risk. We think we understand why they're lower risk. We think they're lower risk because they get very aggressive care. And we don't want the model necessarily to predict that, because if they haven't come into the hospital yet and the model predicts they're low risk, then maybe they wouldn't get admitted to the hospital. They would never get the aggressive care, and they would never then actually be low risk. So you got to be careful about these things. So even though the statistics suggest
maybe
true,
Rich,
yeah,
Rich, in that angle, maybe it's all the way around as well. Maybe because you see that the risk is dropping toward that age, which is fascinating. There is like some form of wake-up call to review the processes of the doctors themselves were treating the patient. I mean, why don't you apply the same process where you have an earlier age between the strike between the 80 and the 100? I mean, is it something that it could be considered as an outcome of that graph, of that model as well?
Completely agree. And in fact, I'll show you a graph in a few slides where we get exactly that kind of take-home lesson. Here, what you'd like to do is this elevation in risk, right as you said, at 85 over to 100. This all seems to be due to less aggressive care. And we would love to just flatten that so that it just goes sort of straight across here from 80, 85 to where it is at 100. Ideally, we would just change the way healthcare is delivered and flatten this. Now, of course, changing the way 500,000 doctors unconsciously make their decisions, and how the patients and their families unconsciously make their decisions. Like, it's not like these policies are algorithms where if we, make a change to the policy, suddenly it happens. The best way we think to change the way the care is delivered is to make these graphs public, is to inform doctors that we see evidence of this. And I'll show you at least 2 more graphs that have this sort of thing, where our main goal was actually to inform clinicians that they're behaving suboptimally and that they can rescue more patients if they change their behavior. Yeah, so I think you're exactly right. Yes. But until we succeed at doing that, we would not want to make the risk look low, because if doctors are going to behave the way they do behave, the risk actually is high. So it's very, very interesting. You can't change the model to suggest the lower risk until you've actually succeeded in changing how hundreds of thousands of doctors and then millions of patients behave. So it's a complicated thing. But I completely agree. And there, I think the biggest value of showing people this is education. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm talking about this is absolutely fascinating. I mean, I'm an outsider, so it's for me something really interesting to see. We have a question on the chat, if I can take this discussion. Yeah, so it's about the scalability of the training process of EBM. I mean, how can it be smooth or complex to some extent, and how do you perceive the challenges with that?
So we don't have any problems with it. It is a little slower than boosted trees, or maybe random forest. It depends on the random forest, but it's a little slower than the best packages for gradient boosted trees. But it's not too slow. I mean, I can easily train a model on hundreds of features, tens of thousands of cases on a laptop in a minute or 2. So it's not too expensive. The biggest problem, if you go to hundreds or thousands of features, the biggest problem is it's an interpretable model. You want a human expert to look at the graphs. And if you've got 100 features, and if the human expert is going to spend, I don't know, 5 minutes per graph, that's 500 minutes, right? So now we're getting close to 10 hours. It's very hard to get a human expert like a doctor to spend 10 hours looking at this, and it's exhausting work if you're doing it carefully. So the biggest problem with scale is actually the intelligibility issues. The model remains intelligible, and you need to have humans who are willing to put in the effort to then look at the model carefully and make changes when changes need to be made to the model, as we're doing here. I'll talk a little more about making changes at the end. We've built a tool to make it easy for doctors to make these sorts of changes themselves, so that they no longer need computer scientists like us to help them. So it's a great question, though. But there's really, I mean, if you've got 10 billion training examples and 100,000 features, well, now the model is getting pretty expensive. But in practice, for any normal size data set that you wouldn't be using deep learning for, it works fine. It's just a little bit slower than some of the fastest other models. By the way, at runtime, the model is extraordinarily fast and compact. Like, the model can easily fit on your smartwatch, and even if it's a complex model. And that's because it really is just 2D and 3D vectors. It's just table lookup. You literally, do binary search on age, read the Y value. Binary search on blood pressure, read the Y value. Binary, you just read those numbers and you just add them. You're not even like doing multiplies. You just add them, and then you have the answer. So it's extraordinarily fast at runtime. Because of that, it's actually used whenever you click on a browser link. There is something behind the scenes that in less than 100 milliseconds decides if that's a safe link for you to click or not. And Microsoft now uses this model to do that, because this is the only model that was both fast enough and accurate enough for them to use. They used to use neural nets, but they were so much more expensive that they had to use very simple neural nets. And this turned out to be more accurate and faster. Yeah.
Excellent. We have one
Okay.
question from Ihab, and then I will
Yeah.
have Dr. Sameh give her also the floor. Ihab here mentioned, in the context of developing machine learning models for disease prediction, how was the variability in patient treatment scenario accounted for in the scenario dataset? Furthermore, was the dataset sufficiently large to and diverse to mitigate biases and ensure comprehensive representation on different patient or population and treatment condition? Yes, he's referring to the example you gave us.
This is a great question, and this is a good time to talk about that. So this particular data set is about 15,000 patients. All of the patients came from, I think, 17 different hospitals in Pennsylvania, one state in the United States. So it does not reflect, what patients might have looked like in California or New York. It comes from one place. But it's a fairly large data set, and we do have a good number of features. So we have 46 features in the data set. And notice down here, right, most of the patients, again, are between like 60 and 90. Notice that's where the error bars in the graph are smallest. And then we have relatively few patients, with pneumonia who are in their 20s and 30s, and the error bars are fairly large there. And the largest error bars are out around 100, and that's because we have the least number of patients at 100. So we do have, let's say underrepresentation at age, 20, 30, and certainly above age 100. We tend to have fewer samples there. And the model is less confident in the prediction it should make in those regions. And what's good about the interpretable model is not only does it tell us what its prediction would be, that's the red line in the middle of the error bars, but it also gives us an idea of how much you should trust it in that region. So this is a pretty good data set. It's not a huge data set, but it's not a small data set. And the model doesn't have any trouble learning an accurate set of functions for 46 features. So if there were 460 features, that wouldn't be enough data. But it's definitely enough data for this particular data set. Oh, and about 10 or 11% of these patients are positive. So only about 1,500 of the 15,000 patients actually do die from pneumonia.
Thank you.
Well, if there's another question, go for it.
Yes, sure. I have a question from Sameh here, and I have another question also on the chat. Sameh,
Sure.
I'll give the floor to you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you, Ara. Yeah, so this is a great model actually, but actually I'm just trying to understand. So in the previous slide, we have seen that we can have different parameters. For example, here we have the age, and you explained in the previous slide that we can have this pneumonia risk score depending on different parameters. I'm just wondering, is it possible to, maybe I missed this information, but is it possible to combine different parameters? And if it's the case, who is gonna decide which parameters we can combine together to calculate this pneumonia risk score?
Great. I'll show you an example of a pairwise interaction. And the algorithm automatically finds what appears to be the most significant pairwise interactions. Pairwise interactions, there's order n squared of them, right? If you have n features, there's order n squared pairs. So that's a lot of terms to add to a model. We have an algorithm that looks at all of the possible pairs and finds the ones that appear to be most predictive. And then we only include those in the model. And I'll show you one of those. As I said, in this model, we ended up keeping 10 pairs in the model. Also, though, sometimes you know about important pairs in advance, and our code, you can tell it, in addition to finding the pairs that the algorithm thinks are most important, you always have to include this pair and this pair, and it will do that. So if you know of pairs that are very important, interactions that are very important, it will do that. You can also go to 3-way and 4-way interactions. The code is general. But again, you start to have intelligibility problems when you get to higher order interactions because you can no longer simply graph them. The surprise to us is that for the vast majority of data sets, we only need pairwise interactions to be as accurate as black box methods. only a few data sets actually require three-way or higher interactions. It's very rare. And part of the reason for that is because not only does the number of interactions grow exponentially with the degree of the interaction, three-way, there's order n cubed three-way interactions, but it turns out the amount of data that you need to properly fit them also grows exponentially with the degree of the interaction. And most data sets are not large enough to fit three-way and four-way interactions reliably. And because of that, there's a bias variance trade-off that occurs. So yeah, the model can fit more complex things, but it can't do them well. And because of that, it adds noise into the model, and the error bars are huge. So it ends up not doing as well. But I will show you an example of a pairwise interaction in a few slides.
Great, thank you.
Cool. Okay, so let me continue. Now, remember, I've told you all this interesting stuff from just this one graph. Sadly, we don't have time to look at all the graphs. Many of the graphs are very, very interesting. And this
Rich,
graph,
I'm sorry to interrupt again, because I do have a follow-up question, and I think that it makes sense that we just capture it now on the manner in which the data is divided and the application of cross-validation affects the final score in this case. Before we move to another one, can you please explain it a little bit further?
Yeah. I didn't explain this at all, but this is a good time to mention that as well. We actually bag the generations of these graphs. So what we do is we'll train the model 10 times, maybe even 100 times, each time with a different random subset of the data. And then these error bars are telling us, maybe we've trained the model 100 times. The error bars are telling us how much all of those runs of the model on different samples of data agree at any one place in the graph. And where the models all agree, the error bar will be 0. That's rare. And where the models disagree a fair bit over those 100 runs, the error bars will be larger. So if you think of bagging as being a way of exploiting cross-validation, that's how we get these error bars on the graphs, the confidences on the graph. In the end, the model is just the average of all of those 100 models. And the good thing about graphs is you can average graphs very easily, and you don't lose any information by doing it. And then, of course, when we're going to report an error on a test set, of course, we'll do an outer level of cross-validation where we hold off some independent test data, train on a subset, and then only test on data that was not used for training. That's independent of this bagging procedure, and our code will automatically do that for you as well if you don't tell it not to. So
very well, thank you.
Cool.
Thank you so much. I see that people are really reacting on the chat, so apologies for interrupting every time.
No,
please, yeah.
No, this is good. Okay. Here's the interesting thing. We can edit the model, but you don't necessarily always want to edit the model, right? If you're an insurance company in the United States, you're hopefully not intervening in patient care, and you just are interested in a patient's probability of survival, because if the patient survives, then you need to keep more money in the bank to pay for their care. So you might just be interested in the fact that, oh, this is very interesting that patients over 100 seem to have a better probability of survival than patients in their 90s. For an insurance company, this might be interesting, but they don't want to edit the model. They don't want to do this to the model. They just want to leave the model the way it is and learn from it. Okay, so this is going to be an important slide because it summarizes a lot of important issues. And we've only looked at one graph, and yet we can already, summarize some important stuff. Whether a model is correct and accurate depends on what you're going to do with its predictions. So I already said that we would want to change the model if we're going to use it to admit patients to a hospital, but we wouldn't want to change the model if we're a health insurance provider. So this really makes a difference. So how you're going to use the predictions determines whether you need to correct the model, whether the model is already correct, whether you trust the model, whether you don't trust the model. It's very important. If someone tells you, oh, the model is great, it's really accurate, and then they don't tell you what they're going to use it for, don't trust them, because nobody can know if the model is accurate and should be used without knowing what it's going to be used for. That's critical. There's no such thing as a model that is accurate. It has to be correct and accurate for a purpose. So that's critical. here's a few things the model learned. First of all, it jumps at round numbers, 85 and 100. Almost always happen because of human social policy effects. It's very rare that we have phase changes, especially in, say, biology or social systems. You do see them in physics, right? There's the boiling point of water and the freezing point of water. You will see that in a graph as a sharp step. This is the asthma risk graph. On the right is patients who have asthma. Notice that patients who have asthma are at lower chance of dying from pneumonia. Hopefully that doesn't sound right. These are patients who have a history of heart disease and recurring chest pain. They are at lower risk of dying from pneumonia. Hopefully that doesn't sound right. These are patients who have an advanced kind of airway blockage that causes a wheezing called stridor that physicians are trained. So these patients have advanced pneumonia, and the model says this is lower risk as well. None of these make sense, right? These are real statistics in the data. I mean, the error bars are large here, but these error bars are small enough that these are real effects in the data. How can it be that having asthma is good for you if you've got pneumonia, having heart disease is good for you, and having advanced pneumonia is good for you if you've got pneumonia, because that would be a sign of being high risk? It turns out the asthmatics pay more attention to their breathing. They get pneumonia, they try their inhaler or other med, it doesn't work. They have a doctor who treats their asthma. The doctor says, oh, the inhaler didn't work. Wow, get in here right away. They get an early appointment. The doctor hopefully diagnoses that they've got pneumonia, and then they get very aggressive care, and they get it faster than most patients who didn't go to the doctor as quickly. So the asthmatics are lower risk, not because they're biologically lower risk, it's because they act in a way that lowers their risk. And patients who don't have asthma don't act as quickly and don't get as aggressive care. Same thing with the heart disease patients. Maybe you had a heart attack or you have bad heart disease. You wake up in the morning, your breathing feels funny. If you're smart, you're thinking, I might be having a heart attack. You call an ambulance, you're at the hospital, the emergency room in less than an hour. You get to the front of the line. Within a minute, they put probes on you and they know you're not having a heart attack. And then later they diagnose, oh, you've got pneumonia, you have a history of heart disease, you're already in the hospital. You get care even faster than the asthmatics. And getting care fast and aggressive care is good for you if you've got pneumonia. For some other illnesses, this wouldn't make a difference, but for pneumonia, it does. Why is stridor good for you? Okay, stridor is a kind of wheezing that you can't ignore. It sounds terrible. It's raspy. It really sounds like the person is struggling to breathe. Imagine two patients who have pneumonia and they're equally high risk. One of them has stridor. You can't ignore that symptom. And the other has, let's say, silent symptoms. You can ignore it. Hey, the patient who has stridor is going to get to the hospital, is also going to get rapid attention, and they're going to get very aggressive treatment once they're diagnosed as having severe pneumonia. And that aggressive treatment is enough that it really can rescue these patients. So these are real statistics in the data. They're fairly easy for doctors to explain why these things look low risk. And the model, unfortunately, does not know that the asthmatics got to the healthcare faster or got more aggressive treatment. It doesn't know that the chest pain patients, went to the ER in an ambulance. None of that is in the model. So it can't explain this observed lower risk for these patients in any other way other than saying, oh, it looks like the heart disease patients, are less likely to die. It doesn't know why. It's up to us to use our background knowledge to try to figure out why. And then if we want to use the model to predict patient risk prior to admission, to maybe say who should come into the hospital today versus who should come in next week, we have to edit these models. So we can flatten the risk by doing this. Or what doctors actually want us to do is say, no, the asthmatics are higher risk, the heart disease patients are even higher risk, and the stridor patients are the highest risk. Edit the models to do this. And we can edit the models. Note that when we do this, the accuracy on our test data, which is a random sample of our training data, so the same statistics that are in our training data are in our test data, our accuracy goes down slightly on our test set when we do this. But the doctors are confident that this is the more correct. safer to use model. This is the model they want to use. And they don't care that the accuracy went down on the test set because that accuracy wasn't correct in the first place. And if you don't do this and you just leave the model the way it is, it turns out the model is rewarded with this high accuracy for predicting the wrong things. And that's because it doesn't know anything about medicine. It just knows the statistics that are in the data set you gave it. That's all it knows. Okay, so this is very important. And you might think you could remove asthma as an input feature and solve this problem by removing the feature. If it doesn't know you're asthmatic, how could it predict your lower risk? It turns out that doesn't work. And that's because there's correlation between asthma, between heart disease, and other features that you have to keep in the model. You can't get rid of all features in the model. There's going to be correlation. And it turns out the bias is in the training signal. It turns out these patients really are more likely statistically to survive. And it turns out removing input features doesn't solve this problem. It just means that the effect of asthma or heart disease spreads now through correlation through all the input features in a complex way that you no longer even know it's there. And you can't identify it, localize it, and edit the graphs. So it turns out now when we're worried about things like asthma bias, heart disease bias, race bias, gender bias, financial bias, age bias, we make sure we keep race and gender in the model. We let the model be as biased as it possibly can be. It learns all the bias that's in the data. Then we can see the bias, and then we can correct the bias. Whereas if we remove the features, it doesn't mean the model is like magically unbiased. It's probably still just as biased, but you can't see it anymore. So it's a very surprising thing. We used to try to eliminate bias by eliminating features that would allow the model to be biased. With interpretable models, that's not the right way to do it. Now you actually should make sure those features stay in the model. Okay. I've been telling you stories about risk as a function of age, and we need to edit the graph, and it learns what seems to be the wrong thing about asthma and heart disease. Let me show you some beautiful thing we learned about this. And this goes back to the question I think Anwa asked earlier about changing how clinicians behave. This is risk as a function of your blood urea nitrogen. So this is a blood test almost all of us have had. And qualitatively, this is kind of right. Low blood urea nitrogen is low risk. Somewhere around 30, it's considered elevated. Notice the risk climbs pretty rapidly. It starts to level off at 50. Then the risk starts to go up again. It peaks at 100. Notice 50 and 100 are round numbers. Remember I said to beware of round numbers. Risk actually goes down past 100. That doesn't make sense. Clinicians are very sure that higher blood urea nitrogen is bad for you. What's happening here? These are treatment effects. So at 50, patients start to be given a medication, and the medication is effective. And that's why their mortality risk sort of flattens right around 50. It even comes down slightly, but let's just call it flattens. Eventually, that medication is not enough. And as their blood urea nitrogen gets higher, the risk goes up. And then it drops dramatically at 100. At 100, patients are starting to be given dialysis. So, and by the way, I didn't even know this. I gave this presentation to an audience of hundreds of doctors. I put the graph up and I said, I don't know why it peaks at 100 and then goes down. And two of the doctors in the audience yelled at me, Rich, it's dialysis. We start to give dialysis at 100. It's really effective. That's what's happening here is, so patients above 50 are getting a treatment, and then above 100, they're getting an even more effective, more aggressive treatment. Now, there's a weird thing though, which is notice the patients who have a blood urea nitrogen of 120 are actually lower risk than the patients who have a blood urea nitrogen of like 90. So the patients who are healthier have higher risk than the patients who are less healthy. That's really unfortunate. Another thing we can do with this kind of model in some cases is we can use it almost like a spreadsheet and say, well, suppose we moved the treatment threshold for dialysis from 100 down to say 85. We can estimate, for reasons I can't explain now, that the risk curve would now be under this red line. The red line is a conservative estimate of what the risk curve would look like. And the area between the red line and the original thing we learned, this is lives saved. And we know how many patients are in here. We know the probability change in mortality. In the US alone, we would save about 2,500 to 5,000 lives. And worldwide, we would save about 50,000 lives per year just by changing the threshold at which dialysis is given from 100 to 85. So doctors do lots of decision-making using round numbers. Oh, around 50, we're going to start giving you that medication. Around 100, we're going to start giving you dialysis. But those numbers are not based on carefully run experiments. They're not optimal. Like, they don't actually think, oh, we should be giving you dialysis at a blood urea nitrogen of 86.72. They don't know that. But this sort of model can be detailed enough to actually help clinicians better zero in on the thresholds at which they might want to start giving care. Now, I would never change all of healthcare worldwide based on a single graph trained on a single data set, from patients in Pennsylvania. I mean, that's a risky thing to do. But immediately, clinicians looked at this and said, wow, we should look into this further, and we should see if we should change the threshold. They thought about giving this med too. It's a safe med. Maybe we should give it to patients starting at 40 as opposed to waiting to 50. So you really can learn a lot from this kind of model, and you can perhaps, change the way clinicians behave. Maybe you can do new clinical trials in order to follow up on this. By the way, notice that there's, the peak goes up and comes back down. And I said, this is a treatment effect. We see treatment effects all over the place in healthcare data. It's actually common in other data as well. So this is your systolic blood pressure. That's the higher of your two blood pressure numbers, and the lowest, the best blood pressure is in this range for systolic, sort of 100 to 140. That's the healthiest range. And having an ultra low systolic blood pressure is bad for you, and having a high blood pressure is also bad for you. But notice the risk goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down, goes up and comes down, and it's doing it near round numbers. Notice this effect at 200. Well, what's happening at 200 is, maybe your systolic is 201, and the doctor says, oh, your blood pressure is 201. That's terrible. We have to do something. If your blood pressure was 198, the doctor would say, oh, your blood pressure is really high. It's almost 200. We got to do something about it. You're going to get more aggressive treatment over 200 than under 200, even though the blood pressure cuff isn't accurate enough to tell the difference between 198 and 201. Ultimately, human beings are making these decisions, and it's the patient who ultimately has to follow the advice of the physician, religiously or not. So it turns out that when you're over 200, you just take it more seriously than when you're under 200, even though statistically it doesn't mean anything. I want to draw your attention to this one as well. Notice, I used to think, like, why doesn't that happen at 175? Because this is 200, this is 225. Why isn't that 175? Why is it happening there? A doctor just explained this one to me a couple months ago. It turns out the definition of what was called hypertensive urgency, high blood pressure, in the 90s, when this data was collected, was 180, not 175. And that's why the graph peaks at 180 as opposed to 175. So it's amazing the kind of detail that we can see. And this is just 15,000 patients from a handful of hospitals. This is nothing special about this data. And yet we're learning all of this sort of details. So it really is remarkable. Okay. Let me show you an interaction, and then we'll be done with pneumonia. And I'll fly through a few more examples. We won't get through as many as I was going to do, but that's fine. You don't need to see them all. You've already got the story. This is risk as a function of age. This is a graph you already saw. This is risk as a function of whether the patient has cancer or not. Remember, we're talking about pneumonia risk here, but this is whether the patient has cancer. And notice that patients who have cancer are at elevated risk compared to patients who do not have cancer. These two graphs are in the model. They're each one of the 46 graphs, but there are things that you can't learn by doing an additive function of one feature plus an additive function of the other feature. You really need to reason about the two features together. And if you think about, if you're computer scientists and you think about exclusive OR, the AND function, you really need to know the value of both features to calculate exclusive OR. If I give you one feature and I say, oh, bit 1 is a 0. And I say, what's the exclusive OR going to be? Well, you don't know. It's 50-50 chance. It'll be 0 or 1, depending on the other bit. So let me show you an interaction. This is now a 3D plot. We have cancer on the x-axis. We have age on the y-axis. And color is the third dimension, and that is risk. And the highest risk is this group at the bottom right. They're yellow. and that is adding 0.5 to their risk. What is the model doing? The model is saying something the opposite of what we saw before. The model is saying the youngest cancer patients are highest risk. That doesn't sound right, because the previous graph, remember, is that the youngest patients are lowest risk. Remember, this is in addition to those other graphs. What this is trying to do is make a correction to those graphs, but only for the patients who have cancer. Why is this happening? Why is highest risk the youngest patients? And then notice that the risk goes back to essentially zero contribution to risk as you become 60, 70, and 80. What's happening is patients who are very young have different kinds of cancers than patients who are elderly. Patients who are young don't have cancer because of smoking or because of environmental factors, working in the coal industry or working in some sort of industry where they're exposed to things. They have a different kind of leukemia, youth onset cancer. Not only do they have a different kind of cancer, but we treat cancer in young patients more aggressively than we treat older patients. That aggressive treatment is more likely to knock out the patient's immune system. If we knock out the patient's immune system and they have pneumonia, everyone in this data set has pneumonia already. If we've knocked out your immune system with the chemotherapy or radiation treatment that we're using to attack your cancer, you are now, unfortunately, more likely to die from pneumonia than maybe you are to even die from the cancer. So because the treatment was so aggressive, your immune system got knocked out, then you got pneumonia, and now you're at very high risk from the pneumonia. So this is what the model has learned, and it learned this completely automatically. There's not a lot that clinicians can do about this, other than pay attention to pneumonia symptoms as early as possible in young patients so that they can give them treatment before the pneumonia becomes advanced. But other than that, there's not a lot that they can do about this. Okay, we're done with the pneumonia data set. If there's questions, this would be a good time. Sure,
yes.
Go for it. Yeah.
Yes. We do have a question on we have one of the participants who used freestyle library 2 as a statistics for his blood pressure. Sometimes the model has been higher than the real blood pressure sugar level. He would like to know for this model how much the error as proportion of percentage is.
Oh, that's interesting. It is the case that when this model predicts that you are extraordinarily high risk, the error bars on that prediction will tend to be larger. And the reason why is there are relatively few patients, which is good, who are extraordinarily high risk. So it will have seen fewer samples there. So the error as a percentage of the risk that it predicts does tend to go up. But this model does not know about the error in the features it measures itself. Like, it doesn't know if blood pressure is measured to an accuracy of 1% or 5% or 10%. It doesn't know that. It does ultimately affect if the supposed feature like blood pressure is measured not very well. In some patients it's underestimated, others it's overestimated, some it's just right. What'll happen is that'll just cause the graph, it'll still have the same general shape, but detail in the graph will tend to be blurred. So these spikes that we see like at 200, at 180, those will become broader, less strong spikes. And that's because we're not measuring that feature as reliably. And it's almost like you do a Gaussian blur across the graph for that feature because of the inaccuracy with which you measure that feature. Age, for example, is something we would reliably know to within plus or minus a year. So our graph can be extremely sharp on age. Like when there's that effect at 85 or the effect at 100, the graph can be extremely sharp on those kinds of features because we measured them with very high precision. And then notice that the retirement effect at 67, 68, 69, that was sharp, but it still takes 3, 4, 5 years for the rise to happen. And that's not because we don't know age accurately, it's because we don't know retirement accurately. This data set, unfortunately, does not have a feature about retirement. So it's only inferring retirement. It doesn't know anything about retirement. It's you and I understand this is a retirement effect, but it is inferring retirement from age. And people in the United States do not all retire at the same age. So there are people who retire, you know, as early as 60, and then people who don't retire until they're 75. So, you know, professors, you know, people like me.
And now with the Gen Z, they are more into the 25 to 30 years old, actually. So it's even. Okay, I have another follow-up question for the same person. So if it's possible to add the error as an algorithm model into the real model, for example, a function including an error detection, is that possible actually to plug it in the model itself?
That's interesting. So I've never thought about that. If you had something that gave us detailed information, and again, there's two kinds of errors. You can have errors in your labels, and you can have errors in the measured features. But I think your intuition is correct that if you were to give us detailed statistical information about either the errors in individual features or errors in the labels, we would be able to take that into account in the learning process. Essentially, you know, if a feature has very low accuracy, we would reduce its weight in the learning of the model. Now, to some extent, it already does learn less from things that are noisier, but we might want to emphasize that. That's a very interesting question. You know, I haven't thought about that or worked on that.
Very well. I also have a request from one of the attendees about sharing any type of a study or reference paper regarding what we're saying right now. If it's possible to share with this group of people, they're very interested to actually learn more about it.
Sure. Happy to do that. And they're easy to find if you look up my last name and you look up generalized additive model. You'll find almost all my papers on this topic that way. The other thing I'm happy to do is, if you want, I'll send you a PDF of the slides, and that might help also.
Yeah, that would be fantastic. One more question regarding that another follow-up. The algorithm such as ANOVA statistics, one direction with p-value, would it be interesting for the exercise?
It's a good question. We don't know how to calculate super accurate p-values with our current algorithm. What we do if we need p-values is we do good old bootstrap sampling. That is, we repeat the process many times and then do bootstrap analysis to calculate p-values. I don't know if ANOVA specifically would help us, but anything that would help us generate more accurate p-values is something we're very interested in. And there are other newer methods in statistics. In fact, just in the last 10 years, we're trying to calculate more reliable confidence intervals. We've tried other things like using Bayesian methods to train the model as opposed to boosted trees. And it turned out the Bayesian methods generated even less accurate confidence intervals and p-values than what we're doing. So we tried to generate more accurate methods using like standard statistical techniques, and that sadly didn't work. But that doesn't mean they all won't work. In fact, there's a new technique that we have our fingers crossed will work well.
Very well. Another question again,
Sure.
Rich. So all the presented findings are when we are looking at to a single feature, what we have seen right now. To which extent the interaction between feature will confirm or reject the findings themselves?
Let's see.
From your experience.
So what's learned in an interaction like this is actually statistically independent, orthogonal to what is learned in the individual graphs of single features. So there is a thing in statistics called functional ANOVA. And functional ANOVA proves that any function, no matter how complex, can be decomposed uniquely into univariate functions, plus pairwise functions, plus three-way functions, plus four-way functions. And there is a unique decomposition and the functions at each level of these decompositions are statistically orthogonal to, independent. They're a different basis set from the functions at the other levels. And that's a great property. And we exploit this property tremendously in both our algorithm and in our interpretation. And we have a way even of, if a little bit of like main effect leaks into this pairwise effect graph, we even have a way of purifying this graph to push that main effect down into the main effect so that these things are orthogonal. What that means is that it's not the case that, say, a pairwise graph will refute the main effect graphs. They're still all additive. Now, what can happen is they can cancel. Like in this case, you know, we already saw in the previous graphs, remember, you know, the 20-year-olds are low risk down here. When we go to this graph, it's saying, well, yeah, they were low risk, but if they have cancer, I want you to add 0.5 to their risk. So in some sense, it's like it's refuting, it's kind of like it's refuting this part of the graph, but it's only refuting that part of the graph specifically for patients who have cancer. It's not refuting that part of the graph for everybody. It's only doing it for what is a small segment of the population. So I'm not sure if I completely answered your question, but hopefully that's good.
Yeah, I think so. I have one additional, question regarding that is about the outliners, actually. How to detect the outliners on the data set.
So in that case, and by outliers, I assume you mean individual patients who are outliers, as opposed to parts of a graph that are outliers. Like when a graph, the very first question we had when we saw this drop in risk at 100 was, wow, the error bars are really big. Is this real? Or is this just noise in the data? Is it just a handful of outliers? Or is this a real signal? We spent more than a month doing statistical analysis with a statistician to figure out that this is probably real, that it looks real statistically. And then doctors later confirmed that, you know, we really do behave this way. This is not, you know, this is not surprising, given that it's pneumonia. So in this case, we did a lot of traditional statistical analysis. I guess the beauty of the interpretable model was it drew our attention to this. And then we went off and did more analysis to try to understand, like, is that real or not? And we decided it's roughly right. It's real in the data. If there are just a few cases in a region that's unpopulated that cause the graph to do something striking, the error bars will be huge typically. So our attention will be drawn to outliers in that way. But other than that, people who are extraordinarily high, or in some cases low risk, we just detect them the same way we would detect outliers with any learning model. That is, you know, we essentially create a histogram. We sort the patients from the highest to lowest risk, and we look for the patients at the two extremes of that risk curve. Okay, shall I quickly run through one or two more data sets, and then we'll just call it quits?
Yes, please. I think we have 6 minutes left, so I'll leave the floor to you on deciding how you want to.
I think we'll do 2 or 3, and that, because we're going to go very fast now. Okay, this is ICU. You're in the critical care unit of the hospital, and we're looking at all-cause possibility of death. This is PF ratio. It's a measure of how well you're breathing. A PF ratio near 0 is very bad. It means you're struggling to get oxygen in your blood. A PF ratio near 1,000 means you're very healthy. Everything looks fine in this graph. You're higher risk if you're struggling to breathe, and you're at lower risk if you're breathing well, except for this. What is happening right there? This makes no sense at all. Why is there a spike right there? Notice that the bottom of that spike, the risk it predicts, is equal to the healthiest patients, the very low risk patients. So why is it doing that? It turns out before we got the data, 60% of the patients are missing their PF ratio. And that's because what they do is they pinch your finger. And if pink returns quickly to your skin, your breathing is fine. You're well oxygenated. So they don't bother to do this more expensive test. 60% of the pneumonia patients are missing their PF ratio, and it was imputed with the mean. And the mean value of this feature, when you don't include the healthy people, is 323. It's right around here. So why is it missing? It's missing because these are so healthy patients, we didn't even bother to measure it. So of course they look like healthy patients, but they're sitting over here in a region that's not healthy. This is really bad. Now the model is doing the best it can. It's predicting high risk to the left and right of this, but it's predicting very low risk right there. And this is bad because some patients really do have a PF ratio of 323. They really are sitting in this region, and they're going to get predicted as being low risk. The model is not going to recognize that they're high risk. So you really need to do something to fix this. Now you could try editing the graph, get rid of the spike, but then if you're going to impute with missing values, you're in trouble. You'll predict people are high risk when they're not. So you really have to figure out how to handle this. And the important part of this was that just looking at the graph, within a minute, we knew we had a problem. It took us 15 minutes to figure out what the problem was. And then we realized we had to change the way we were handling missing values in the data. We didn't even know there were missing values that somebody else had handled in the data before we got it. We suddenly knew we had a problem that we had to fix. And intelligibility has completely changed how we deal with missing values now. And that's because there are about a half a dozen methods that are commonly used for dealing with missing values. It's an interpretable model. We do all 6 of them. We train the model 6 times, and we put the graph side by side. And we can actually tell, like, oh, that's bad. Oh, that's even worse. This will kill patients. Oh, I don't like that method, but that's the one that's working best. We should do that. So it has, now that we can actually see what complex high accuracy models are learning on data that has missing values, it is revolutionizing how we deal with missing values. Very, very interesting. This is housing price data. This is not medical data. We're trying to predict the value of a piece of property. And we're trying to predict its value based on, oh, its square footage, how many bathrooms, how many bedrooms, you know. One of the features is the year that the property was built, that the house was built. And notice there's this very unusual spike happening right here, which adds $600,000 to the value of houses. That doesn't make any sense. I mean, it wasn't a bad year, but there was nothing extraordinary about this year in terms of real estate. So notice the model is just immediately telling us we have some funny problem in the data. So what we do is we go to the data, we search for everything that happens in 1989. That's where that spike was. We notice there are a whole bunch of things that sold for $8 million. They're all condos. They're all in the same zip code, so they're all in the same place, but they're different in terms of bedrooms and bathrooms and their size. What happened here was someone accidentally put down as the value of this property when it sold, they put down the value of the entire building, not the value of the individual condos. So what's happening is we have a large sample of data, you know, maybe 20 or 30 units in this building. The building sold for $8 million, but not the individual condos. They all sold for different prices. And that's what this spike is. And immediately looking at the graph just tells us, oh, we got a problem in our data. Need to figure out what's happening in 1989. We just do a query on the data. Immediately we find this problem. And now we either remove this from the data or we look up the value of the individual condos if the data is not too old to do that. You know, we immediately know that the model is not right. And you would not want to deploy a model this way. This model would, if you were an investor, the model would tell you, wow, I'm going to invest all of my all of my resources into properties built in 1989. And you know, there's no evidence that that's actually true. If anything, 1989 is a suboptimal year compared to new properties and older properties. So anyway, you know, this sort of thing can tell us about the data. Okay. Maybe I should just stop.
Yes, I think that our time is unfortunately over, but we do have one last question from Salma here about the noisy data. Is it the same methodology we take with the noisy data? Could we detect them based on this model as well? How do you perceive that?
Yes, the model is very good. If it's noisy data that is large enough to affect the model, then this will help us detect it. But if we just have one sample, I mean, suppose we have one sample and the age, should have been 25 and instead it's listed as 65. Well, the model, probably isn't going to help us detect that. There is one thing. So working with doctors on COVID, some of the stuff I just skipped over was COVID analysis from the last few years. Working with doctors in New York City, which was where COVID first hit bad in the United States, they looked at a graph. It was risk as a function of age, much more dramatic than what we saw for pneumonia because COVID is so much more severe, especially in the early days. The doctor looked at the graph. The graph went out to like 117 instead of going to like 105. And the doctor, we had statisticians from the hospital, and the doctor said, Jim was one of the statisticians. Jim, I thought we solved this problem with these patients at 117. I thought we got rid of that problem last year. What's going on? Obviously, they're back in our data set again because they don't have patients who are 117. Their oldest patients are sort of 105-ish. And they're like, Jim, what's going on? How did that happen? So they just took one look at the model, and the model just immediately said, oh, there's signal out at 117, and they know that's not the case. So that's a weird form of detecting noise in data. And now you could detect that anyway. You could just look at the min-max of your feature values, and you would see, oh, geez, why do we have patients who are over 110? The beauty of this is they were really just looking at the model to understand COVID, but all these other things are just there automatically in the graphs as well. And sometimes you discover things that have nothing to do with COVID. They have to do with how your data was pre-processed. So like you'll find problems that have to do with data. You'll find problems that have to do with bias and how the data was collected. You'll find problems that have to do with missing treatment effects. You'll find problems that are just real, and sometimes the doctors don't even believe it, and then they see enough evidence and they start to believe it. You see all these things all at the same time in the model, and you never know. But we have never seen a data set where we don't uncover a few surprising problems. Like never. I mean, we've now used this thing on 50 data sets, I guess, that I've been involved with. And every time we find something surprising, like no data set has ever been perfect. So that's the first bullet here. Every data set has different kinds of flaws: bias, confounding, missing features, treatment effects. Without interpretability, it's hard to find these things. And the best tool right now is probably this interpret ML thing. So this is our open source package. And by the way, you can find pointers to papers by going to this GitHub repo as well. Hey, any more last minute questions? Or if you guys have to leave, you should just go. So.
No, I think that it was really very interesting, Rich. Thank you so much. We're having very good feedback on the chat here, and I truly appreciated the session. It went by super fast for your information.
They were great questions. So thank you.
Yeah,
it's much more fun doing it that way.
Totally. Thank you so much for your time and for this gesture on paying it forward in a sense. We truly appreciate that. We do hope that you will have other sessions like that. If you have anything to add, Rich, please feel free